Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Wine, Women, and Words. And joining me, as always, is Michelle.
Hello.
And our guest this evening is Bryn Turnbull. We are here to discuss her book, The Paris Deception. So thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's so nice to be back on your podcast.
Oh, we love having you, and we're so excited to be able to have you in chat again. Because I remember last time we had a lot of fun when you were on the last episode.
Well, you know what? Like anything that combines books and wine, like what's not to love?
Exactly.
I mean, really.
That's what I'm saying. And this book is, I'm just started it. So I'm only a few chapters in and I'm already in love with it. So I can't wait to delve into as much as I've read for it. So don't worry, those listening, we're not going to do any spoilers. And especially because this book just came out, what was it, late May? That's like what, a little over a week ago?
It came out on Tuesday, not even a week.
Wow.
It came out on May 30th. Yeah.
Congratulations.
So you're in pub week, full pub week mode.
Oh yeah. I love it, honestly. Like we spend so long in our little writer caves. Like whenever I get the chance to emerge from the writer cave and be like, here's the thing that I made over all this time, it feels very, very good.
The reason I have been losing sanity for the last X number of months or years or however long.
All the pieces fall into place for my family and friends. And they're like, oh, she's like dressing again. Good.
I like to
the
call
writer
it,
bun has come down.
It's called Lebowski-chic. That's what the wardrobe is.
Lebowski-chic.
The official
That is
terminology for it.
It's exactly what it is. The dudette.
Yes. Just call me the dudette. Walking around, for those of you who've not watched The Big Lebowski, this is your homework for the weekend. Watch The Big Lebowski. We're basically hair all messy, up in a bun sometimes not. We've got the bathrobe, drinking whatever concoction is in our sippy cup. May or may not be a White Russian. You never know.
Slippers, as I recall, are a big part of the look.
Exactly. And we're just off in our own little world.
Mm-hmm.
Not to be confused with the laundry bun, which is an entirely different, and the laundry attire, which is whatever is left at the end of the clothing period. Yeah. That is, I was just dealing with the laundry attire today, so I'm very much in that mode. That's why I bring it up. It's a very distinct and different look.
Mm-hmm.
It is a very distinctive look. I am in an apartment building where we don't have laundry in the unit. So like you have to go downstairs and like interact with people. And it's always like on the days where I'm like, I'm actually going to make an effort when I go to do my laundry. Nobody, like it's absolutely empty in the laundry room. But on the days where I'm like, I am wearing literally whatever is moderately clean, that is always the time where there's a cute boy in the laundry room. Every single time. Without fail.
It's like Murphy's Law, but in reverse.
It is. I know.
So we are actually here to not talk about Lebowski-chic and Laundry Day Chic. We're actually here to talk about the book. So for those who are not familiar with the Paris Deception, can you give us a little bit of a synopsis about it?
Absolutely. So The Paris Deception, it's a novel about art theft and forgery in Nazi-occupied Europe. And the bulk of the action of the book takes place in this museum in Paris called the Jeu de Paume. And historically, this was a museum where the Nazis took all of the art that they looted from Jewish families across conquered Europe. They would take it to this museum. They would put up the pictures that they liked on the walls. High-ranking Nazis, predominantly Hermann Goring, would come into the museum, pick which pieces he liked, and send them off to his home, of course, with absolutely no compensation for the painting's rightful owners. So my book takes place in this museum, and it involves a young woman, a conservator named Sophie, who works in the museum. She works restoring paintings, and she realizes what is going on, what is happening now that the Germans have taken over this museum. And she resolves to save a particular genre of painting that is going into this museum called the Degenerates. So basically the Degenerate collection, it was anything that Hitler didn't like. So we're talking like modernist paintings, postmodern, cubist, really anything that was not directly representational, Hitler hated. And so she teams up with her estranged sister-in-law, who's an artist, and they work together to replace the paintings in the museum with clever forgeries in order to save the originals for their rightful owners. It's a rollicking story with everything you could want to read about. At least that's what I think.
It is fascinating, and it really gets connects you, because like I said, I just started reading and I'm like, okay, I'm not going to be able to put this down because I'm just going to keep reading it. It's so well done. And I love the fact
Thank
that you
you.
brought up, we're going to get into research in a little bit, but I love the fact that you brought up the modernist movement and how Hitler did not like that, which was something I came across as well, but how much he absolutely despised it.
Yes, he did. You know, Hitler, one thing, I mean, I feel like a lot of people know it kind of generally. Hitler was a failed artist, and he was rejected from art school, I believe, twice. And it kind of put into his mind this notion of like what art was and what art wasn't. And what art wasn't in his mind was art that questioned the status quo. So we're talking about, as I said, Cubism is a perfect example. Impressionism, again, you know, it basically anything that did not look at the world as it was and present it as a classical depiction of that world. He did not like that. So in the 1930s, what he did, he and the Nazi Party came up with this notion of degenerate art. They came up with this formal definition. They went into all of the public art museums in Germany, pulled out every piece of art that they had deemed degenerate. And I mean, I should also say, certain artists were degenerate as well. So, you know, Jewish artists, LGBTQ artists, these were also considered degenerate. Anyway, so he takes all of this art, takes it all out of the museums. He tours it around Germany in an exhibition called Entartete Kunst, which meant degenerate art, which was a very deliberately obtuse and deliberately malicious representation of what this art was and what it was trying to say. And then in 1930, oh gosh, it's in the front of my book. I think it was 1939.
Yeah, that was when your prologue is. Yeah.
Yeah, in the prologue. I know, it was either 37 or 39. So in 1939, the Nazis took all of this art that they had toured around the Reich, piled it in front of the Reichstag, and burned it in a like formal, bonfire.
Mhm.
And so that was the degenerate art movement. That's like, and I mean, these are artists that you know, that we know and love. We're talking Van Gogh, we're talking Picasso, Braque, Dali, all of these artists that today we look at and recognize for being, you know, forerunners in their field, and artists who truly did change the face of visual representation. These are artists that Hitler considered degenerate. And so this is the collection that Sophie has resolved to save, because she understands what it represents, not only aesthetically, but also the idea of, you know, like it all came from the same horrible place that led to the Holocaust, right? It was what is ideologically pure, what is ideologically degenerate. That all came from that same hateful mind.
And it was interesting for me. So when I came across Hitler's despise of the modernist movement, it was in researching Italy during the 1930s. And interestingly, in Italy, Mussolini was a fan of the modernist movement. And there was a modernist, I want to call him a philosopher. He might not necessarily be that, but he was against pasta. And he had this whole thing that pasta and sauces were what make you sluggish. That's what kept Italy from being this great world power, like the other Western countries was the sauces.
Carbohydrates.
It was the sauces. So carbohydrates and the sauces. So like the spaghetti sauces that we come to love about the Italian
Interesting.
culture. Yeah. And so Mussolini wanted to, he used that as a means to try to get people to eat more rice. And he pushed rice. And you can find this modernist recipe book. The modernist recipe book is available online. You can look it up, and it's awful. It is just, I've looked at these
Ugh.
recipes and they're god awful. There's no seasoning, no sauces at all whatsoever. It's these piled, the way to describe it without sounding crude, you got the rice as a base at the bottom, and then you got this big stalk of celery at the top, like sticking out of the rice.
Oh,
Yeah. And it was just, it took a modernist look at the food, but totally devoid of any kind of like traditional stuff, to the point where the Italians were actually using it as a means of rebelling against Mussolini. That was like their thing, like, okay, screw you, we're going to eat pasta. And then when Hitler came along and they became friends, he was like, okay, I want to be like you because we're best bros. And he completely ditched the whole modernist idea for pasta and everything.
wow. That is absolutely bonkers.
Right?
That's what I've never heard of. I feel like that would have been in a text at some point from you about the pasta philosophy.
Oh, really? And I did not tell you about this? Because
Maybe I chose to just block that out completely.
well, Stanley Tucci was the reason why I came across this little bit of history that I went down this rabbit hole, because in Finding Italy,
he talks about that.
Yeah, about how pasta was at one point a sign of rebellion. And during
Maybe I do
during
remember
World
you
War
telling me
II.
this.
Yeah, and
I
I was
smell a novel here.
exactly. Exactly. And I was just like, what is this? And I need to find out what's going on. And I went down this whole rabbit hole about pasta and the modernist movement and the
Wow.
connection to Mussolini and Hitler. And I was just like, this is ridiculous. So
I'm glad to hear that, because
yes.
that is something people should know. I had no idea. Yeah.
And it's great to see, like, showing how, I don't want to say necessarily great to see, but it's to be able to see the actual effect of his disdain for the modernist movement and how that led to destruction of art. And those are works that are treasures that we will never get back.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing is, I mean, so much of this artwork, like so much of it, we don't know what it is. Like, we don't know what it is now because it was destroyed. And what a shame, because, you know, knowing who these artists were, it must have been magnificent. But, you know, one of the reasons for this in Hitler's mind was abstract art provides a different perspective on the world. It presents an alternative way of thinking. And what need is there for an alternative way of thinking when you develop the quote unquote perfect society? So that's what it represented to him. That was the fear. And that was the danger of modern art in his mind, was it's presenting a way of thinking that he could not control. And that is what was so, that's what was so threatening about it. And that's why he felt it needed to be destroyed. And what a blessing that it wasn't all eradicated, right?
Yes. Yes. And in some ways it's kind of a blessing that the art was hidden away and then we find it later on, because then it meant that we can still find these treasures, things that we thought were lost.
Very much so, yeah.
Michelle's just like dominating the conversation.
No, I'm trying to figure out how to get my camera to stop moving on me, because all of a sudden it like zooms really far
It's
out
very-
and then it like zooms. I'm like, how close are we getting here? Because
your camera is working hard. Like
it is.
yeah,
And I
it's going in
don't
and
understand
out.
how to make it stop. But we have to talk for a second. Obviously, we have to dive into research because
Mhm.
that's one of our favorite whenever we're talking. I mean, not necessarily just historical fiction, because research touches a lot, many, many genres, but especially for historical fiction, the research is there's, and with this book, there are so many rabbit holes that you can go
Yes.
down. And I'm curious, Diana and I take turns reading our books for the interviews, because if we both try to read a book a week plus a book of the month plus maintained a life, it would be very challenging. So she's
Yeah.
reading this book right now, but I have it on my list to read. But I would like to talk about the research into the art forgery side of the novel, because that must have been very interesting to dive into.
It really was. I mean, so when you write a book, or not even when you write a book, when you are planning a book, so much of it you kind of like can yada yada a little bit, like in the drafting phase, right? So you're like, and this happens and this happens, and then they decide to forge art, yada yada yada, they do it, and great. And my publisher reads the synopsis and goes, great, absolutely, we love it, let's do it. They sign, I sell the book to them, and then I have to actually figure out what the yada yada is, right? Like I've got to figure out how exactly they forge this artwork. And initially, when I had started drafting the book, I was intending on using a method of forgery that was historical. It was used by a guy named Han van Meegeren, who sold a fake Vermeer to Hermann Goring during the war. And this is the deal. Oil paints, when you paint with oil paint, they don't dry fast, like at all. We're talking months of drying time is needed for an oil painting, depending on how thick the layers of paint are on that canvas. So if you are creating a forgery, and that forgery is of a painting that is hundreds of years old, all that paint has to be dry, which is very difficult to do with oil paint. So what Han van Meegeren would do when he was forging these Vermeers is he would bake bakelite, which is an early resin plastic. He would mix it into his oil paints, paint the painting, and then bake the entire canvas in a giant oven. Pull it out and then crack the painting over the side of a table. Put India ink, like wash it over with India ink to create like dirt in the cracks. And that would give it this convincing air of authenticity.
Wow.
Side note, it was not actually that convincing. People just really, really, really wanted to see a Vermeer. You look at his paintings and you're like, there's no way on earth that is actually, like, anybody could have thought that was a Vermeer, because it just is not. But that aside, I thought initially that was the method of forgery I was going to use. Until, as I started writing the book and as I started learning more and more about painting and about art forgery, I realized that that method of forgery would have resulted in paint that looked overaged for the age of the paintings that Sophie and her sister-in-law Fabienne are forging, because novel, those paintings are maximum 30 years old. Well, 30, 40 years old. So if I had used this method of forgery, the paint would have been too brittle and there would have been too many cracks in the canvas. And so that would have been a sign to an art connoisseur that that painting was not authentic. So I had to go back to the drawing board and think, okay, well, how do I do this now? Because I've already sold the book. I have to, they are forging paintings. That has to happen. How am I going to do it? And I ended up settling. I mean, I don't want to give away too much, but I ended up looking into the historical development of acrylic paint and what is the chemical composition of acrylic paint? How do you make it? How does it How does it act differently? How does it act the same? Would it be plausible for them to go down that road? Dot, 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 dot. And basically, I know far too much about the chemical composition of paint now. That's really, really all I could say. But these are the kind of tangents. It's so fun to do, right? It's so fun when you when you have to figure out that mental exercise. And then you find the solution. You're like, oh my God, I think I can do it. And all of a sudden there's like this gigantic weight that's lifted off your shoulders. And you're like, okay, we figured it out. The yada yada is now articulate.
There needs to be like a historical writing handbook called The Art of the Yada Yada.
The art of the yada yada. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. I will also say, on the subject of forgery. So I ended up finding a number of art forging manuals, a couple from the time period, which was really, really cool. Most art forging manuals are not in print all that long because people do not want art forging manuals in print because they teach people too much. So I ended up tracking down a number of out of print art forgery manuals, which helped me kind of figure out what I was doing. And then I ended up actually speaking to an art forger, which was very, very cool, who talked to me about how they went about forging their paintings. Can't say too much more about that for obvious reasons. But so much of forging a work of art is not actually about the paint on the canvas, right? Because like if you look at a painting, if you were to take it out of its frame, there's going to be a line around the actual painting that has to be the right age. You can't just use a brand new canvas and say, I'm gonna plonk something on a brand new canvas that's supposed to be 40 years old, because the linen won't look right. The nails in that painting will not look right. There won't be rust around the canvas nail holes where the canvas is nailed into the stretcher. The varnish over top of the painting has to be aged appropriately. It's not going to be crystal clear. So all of that stuff as well goes into an art forgery. It's not just putting paint on canvas and hoping that it looks the same. And that's what's really tricky about it.
I'm so fascinated by all of that. And I'm like, ooh, I just love all things art forgery now, just based on what you said. But what I also like from that is that when it comes to research, how, when people talk about, oh, how do you do this research? How do you get it? There's people who are willing to talk to you about it. They're willing to say, okay, let me talk to you about my trade. Let me talk to you about what I do. Whether it's professors here in the United States, historians, art forgers, that's just the fact that you're able to talk to one is really cool.
It came about so by chance, but I mean, right person, right time, and that was incredible. The other group of people that I got to talk to in writing this book were art conservators. So art conservation in the book, Sophie's called a restorer because that was the term at the time, but now we call them conservators, who work on restoring paintings and objects, objects and artifacts and preserving them. And I ended up through my old roommate, actually my university roommate, getting in touch with an art conservator in New York who put me in touch with conservators at the Met, the Museum of Natural History, and MoMA. And I ended up getting to have like personal tours of those facilities with those art conservators who were so generous with their time and talked me through so much that I wouldn't have been able to find just in the books. Because again, like with the art forgery, I found art conservation manuals from the 1930s and 1940s. So I knew kind of like what tools Sophie would have in her kit. I knew what solutions she'd be mixing up. But what I didn't know was the philosophy behind art conservation and how today it's completely different from what it was in the 40s. Because in the 40s, art conservation was all about like, make the thing pretty. If there's a knife slash down a canvas, we put the slash back together, we make it look really good, and we just make it look exactly as it was. But nowadays, art conservation has the notion of provenance built into it. And provenance means basically the fact that a painting has an entire life after the moment that it leaves an artist's studio. And all of that life needs to be acknowledged in the history of that piece. So if that painting was slashed by a bayonet at some point, yes, you want to make sure that the piece is going to be stable. You want to repair it to the point where it's not going to degrade the canvas, but you also want to be able to acknowledge the fact that this painting was slashed by a bayonet. And why was it slashed by a bayonet? Who did the slashing? How has that influenced the piece moving forward? Because all of that history gets baked in. And that's one of the reasons that art, the art that was looted by the Nazis from these Jewish families, this notion of provenance is so important, because that was a theft that happened. These paintings were stolen. And to this day, I think there's still over 100,000 pieces that have not been recovered and restored to their families. And so learning about the history of each of those paintings is also just an absolutely fascinating and necessary part of art conservation now.
And as I mentioned before, they're still finding them. There was,
Yes,
not even like a year ago, somebody died, and maybe it was a couple of years ago, where somebody died and it was behind a wall in his apartment for all these paintings that they had.
Yeah, I believe that was the son of Hildebrand Gurlitt, if that's the same case that I'm thinking of. And he's an art dealer who makes an appearance in my book, because he was this Swiss dealer who worked with the Nazis to sell paintings on the degenerate. So the classical collection, the Nazis would keep for themselves. The degenerate collection, they burned a lot of it, but they also realized that they could sell pieces on to collectors outside of Germany. Like in Germany, it was all about ideological purity, but in Switzerland and in America and in, Asia, there were collectors who maybe didn't care or were happy to turn a blind eye to the fact that these paintings have been stolen. And so dealers like this man, Hildebrand Gurlitt, would come in and negotiate in order to buy these paintings from the Nazis, or exchange paintings from their collection in order to get a hold of them and sell them on to their own collectors.
It's like the Ryan Reynolds movie, The Woman in Gold.
The Woman in Gold,
Yeah.
very much so. Exact same world.
Until you said it, I was like, there's a movie that discusses this. So thank you, because that was driving me crazy.
Yeah. So there's The Woman in Gold, and the other movie that discusses this is The Monuments Men. Yeah, it was a great movie. So it was George Clooney, like basically an entirely stacked cast. And the Monuments Men were this group, this organization. They had representatives from all of the Allied nations, and they were art specialists who worked together to restitute paintings after the war to their rightful owners. And the Monuments Men and Women actually are still at work today. The Monuments Men and Women Foundation still is working to restore paintings to their rightful owners.
We spoke to an author, was it The Paris Secret, Michelle?
That sounds about right.
Yeah, it has to be like almost
that was
over
a
3
few
years
years ago.
Yeah, where she talked about that, and her book deals with the Monuments Men and the after effect of it. And it's nice to know that there's still people working on restoring these paintings to their rightful owners.
Very much so. There's another organization which was incredibly useful while I was writing this book. It's called the ERR Project. So the ERR, the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, that was the German commission that took over the museum and basically used it as this warehouse shopping mall. And the ERR Project, they have got records of all of the paintings that passed through the Jeu de Paume Museum during the war. And they are working now to restore, to locate those paintings that have not yet been restituted and restore them to their families. And that organization, a lot of their initial research, a lot of their initial database came courtesy of this one woman who worked within the Jeu de Paume named Rose Valland. And she was a resistance operative who, for the entire 4 years of the war, worked in this museum, like shoulder to shoulder with the Nazis, hid the fact that she could speak German, made copies of basically everything that they were doing, surveyed them. She was fired a number of times and managed to keep like finagling her way back into the museum to save these works of art. She stopped a train from being taken out of France into Germany at the very end of the war. Her intelligence stopped that train. I mean, this woman was just an absolute rock star. And her work and her records today form the basis of a lot of this restitution work.
That's amazing.
Wow.
And it shows just how tenacious and resourceful and strong so many people of that generation were, and how many women were working in the background to be able to save not just lives but works of art, works of our culture.
Yeah, very much so.
There was just a lot to process in that that conversation.
And I don't want to move away from the art history too fast, Michelle, because I know how much you love it. So I want to be able to be the generous friend because I'm a giver.
Well, because once upon a time I was very, very much into art history, and even though I have like zero artistic abilities, I was like, oh, I want to work in art conservation and do that kind of many moons ago. So anything with art history, I'm always like, rabbit holes. Yeah, I'm very excited to read this book because it sounds like it is absolutely, it's like calling my name from my TBR list.
I'm so glad. You know, it's so funny. The rabbit holes, like I think this is one of the privileges of being an author, is like we get to indulge our nerdiest inclinations where it's like, yes, I want to learn about art conservation, so I'm going to write a book about it selfishly so that I can learn everything there is to learn about art conservation. Well, not everything, but like I can learn a little sliver of art conservation and like satisfy that intellectual itch in my brain. And then the next book I'll move on to whatever else. But I love being able to do that as an author, to be like, what is it that, what do I want? Do I want to learn about aviation? Let's learn about aviation today. And then, yeah, next thing you know, you are sweet talking your way into an airplane.
Which I'm assuming
it's just for research purposes.
It's for research purposes. I actually did that for my first book. Yeah. A first scene that never made it into the book, but yeah, I managed to finagle my way onto Edward VIII's plane, which was very cool.
Nice.
Really?
Yeah.
Love it. Now, even though it didn't make it into the book, I do feel like for a subsequent book in the future, you're going to have to use it because we've got this knowledge
always there.
Well, exactly. Well, and this is why historical fiction, well, not just historical fiction authors, I think authors in general make the best ringers at like bar trivia. Because we have got like the weirdest, most esoteric little pools of knowledge that if some category comes, like if an art conservation category comes up in the bar crawl, I'm like, I'm your girl.
History, I got it. Random pop trivia.
History, that's me.
I'm great when it comes to the trivia.
I know about the modernist resistance movement of pasta.
Yes, exactly. I mean, you know that's going to come up for a bar trivia night.
Of course.
It needs to be a trivia team of just the authors.
Yes.
You'd be unstoppable.
We would be. We would definitely make a killing. Especially if we have a murder author on there too.
You need to get like all the genres and all the possible rabbit holes that you could go down.
Okay, can I tell you about the, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, can I tell you about the nerdiest board game on earth? And it's the greatest thing in the world.
Please.
It's called the Great Penguin Book Chase.
Okay.
From what I understand, only 75 of these games were made for Penguin's 75th anniversary. And it's essentially Trivial Pursuit, but it's exclusively like book related. So all the different categories, it's like arts and letters, children's novels, sci-fi and fantasy. And you've got little books on the board, and you have to like fill up your bookcase as you go around with like a book from each one. Anyway, my friend had this when I was living in Scotland, and I became completely obsessed with it. And I bought it. I managed to find a copy and I bought it. And it is an amazing game. I have never won it. For some reason, I always think that I'm gonna win, and I never do. But it is incredibly, incredibly amusing.
Oh, I need this game in my life right away.
Yeah.
Birthday, Christmas presents, any
Great Penguin book chase. I'm telling you, it's the board game. The one to go for.
You need anybody out there listening who needs a present for that?
It's a Friday present.
You know, you don't want to get them another gift card. That's what you need to go with.
That is epic. I need to find that.
It's amazing.
But what I was thinking before about all of your research about art forgery from the 1940s was your Google history must be a very interesting kind of list of searches.
It's an interesting list of searches, and it means that I get like really weird advertisements.
You too? Because I get quite a few as well.
Always, like, I get weird advertisements on Instagram and like on the Google banners and everything. But I also feel like most authors are also on government watch lists, because, like, let's be serious, every single one of us has Googled like how to kill somebody without leaving any trace whatsoever. Like, how do you do this? Like, for me, for this book, it was how do you break into a heavily fortified museum in the middle of the night that is crawling in grounds that are crawling with the Nazis.
You're definitely on somebody's watch list.
There's a list somewhere.
You're on Mama's watch list now.
Well, and I ended up going to Paris when I was researching this book, and realized that the museum, not only is it like in an area that was like very heavily occupied, it's also within the grounds of the Jardin de Tuileries, which means it's surrounded by this very high and imposing iron gate. And so that caused a whole big thing. So I ended up spending 2 days in Paris, like hunched over my notebook, scuttling around the perimeter of the museum, trying to figure out, well, if I were to stage a heist, how would I do it? Where would I go? What's this door go to? Where about that? Like, yeah. So I definitely, I'm not sure I'm welcome back at the Jeu de Paume anytime soon.
I could just imagine.
They've got my photo behind the counter being like, not her.
Yeah, the security are coming up going, pardon me, ma'am, what are you doing here? Oh, no, it's okay. I'm a writer. It's okay.
I'm only imagining how to steal your collection. I'm not actually going to do it.
Just trying to write a very convincing scene.
Yes.
About someone who see, do it, hypothetically.
Yeah,
exactly. I'm just giving my readers a manual for how to do it.
And then while I've got you here, Mr. Security Guard, could you tell me some really good secrets about how to steal the artwork? Research purposes only, I swear.
Exactly. Research purposes only.
Where are some blind spots on the grounds that are really concerning for you? See,
where does this door lead and that door lead?
When authors get signed with agents and publishers, I feel like you all should get badges or some kind of ID that identifies you as authors. That way, when security guards think you're casing a museum, you can hold up your ID and say, no, it's for a book. See,
I promise this is a legitimate thing.
But you guys know
this is for my job.
We're going to be the first people that they look at as well, especially if we have the ID badges, where, like the case of the woman who murdered her husband, well, she put it all in her book. I mean, that was mistake number one.
Yes. Oh my gosh.
But we're going to be the first ones they look at. We can never get away with anything, because they're going to just look at our books and be like, okay, so she stole all this artwork and she lays out how she would do it in this book.
The character
no,
hides
it's
all
all
the
supposed to be
stolen art over
hypothetical. Don't
here.
bring it. And then this is see in the case of my characters, the thing that they have that I don't is like legitimate artistic ability. So even if I wanted to steal all these paintings and replace them with forgeries, I couldn't, because I could not forge a work of art to save my life. So that's what saves me, I think, in this hypothetical.
I would probably end up like the Spanish restorers who end up destroying the work of art.
Oh gosh. Oh, remember that lady? Yeah.
I'm sorry, I couldn't help but bring that up. That's just restoration gone wrong.
Oh, I know, that was painful to look at.
Yes. And for those of you who don't know, go ahead and Google it. It's soul crushing to see what happened.
I think it
with
was,
those.
were they not calling it Monkey Jesus at one point?
I think so. I think they were.
Yeah, it is a genuinely distressing thing to look at.
Yeah,
when you
I
look at what
believe
the
the
original
government.
was.
Yeah, I believe the government ended up eventually had to step in and be like, no more restorations. Like really step it up. At least I don't know what they ended up doing to get that to stop, but it was heartbreaking.
That it's smart that you say something like that on a recorded podcast, that you have no artistic ability. That way there's a record of you saying you have no, that, you know, that way they can maybe take you off of their list. It's all part of the
by
plan.
design. Well, one thing I had a lot of fun figuring out was like how they were going to get individual canvases out of the museum, because that's a whole thing. Is like they start doing it on an individual basis. And so how do you get how would you get a canvas out of a museum without it being detected, right? And I ended up, so it's funny how things from your past can kind of like come into play, and you go, oh my God, that's why that conversation happened 1,000 years ago. And for me, it was a conversation with a professor of mine I think I was in my first year of university, my undergrad. And I took a course on Milton's Paradise Lost from the professor's name. His name is Valentin Boss. I know that this is like a total tangent, but Valentin Boss was one of like the foremost experts on Milton and on Paradise Lost, and on the fact that Paradise Lost had been banned in Soviet Russia because it was considered a revolutionary text. It was considered, you know, a text about rebellion, which, I mean, of course, it's about the devil. It's about the ultimate rebellion, you know, Satan, Lucifer's fall from grace. Anyway, he, as a young man, felt it was important to bring Paradise Lost into Soviet Russia. And so he did it. He would translate it. He translated all of Paradise Lost, which is a very lengthy tome, translated it into Russian and hid it in the lining of his raincoat, and would smuggle it into Russia in the lining of his raincoat. And I remember hearing this when I was, 19 years old, and thinking that was the coolest thing I'd ever heard. And so when it came time to figure out how to smuggle paintings out of Nazi occupied Paris, that little conversation came back to me. Anyway, it's kind of funny how things crop up from your past and you go, oh, that's neat.
Every little thing that we hear and see and do is all fodder for a future book. So
Could end up.
yeah.
Could end
So
up.
don't piss off an author, because they will make you a villain or an idiot. You never know. It depends on their mood.
If I were made into a villain in somebody's book, I'd be like, okay, I can respect that. If I were made into an idiot in someone's book, I'd be very upset.
Yeah. I
Like, oh,
honestly,
I was gonna say, I'm not sure which one would be worse. I guess it depends on like
no,
the
idiot
villain
would be
status.
way worse.
you know what? I'd understand both. If it was me,
I get it.
Yeah, I probably did that dumb thing.
I can see it. Okay.
Mhm. That tracks.
Well, everyone, the Paris Deception is now out in the world, and Bryn, you have to continue celebrating Pub Week. I hope you have many wonderful plans for the rest of the week that involve hydrating and celebrating.
That they do. Absolutely. Well, it's been such a pleasure chatting with you both. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. As always, it's an absolute
Yeah,
pleasure.
Oh,
absolutely.
it's such a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us.
And
thank you.
if you all would like to order your own copy, you can always check on the link in our show notes to our bookshop on bookshop.org. As always, bookshop.org supports our incredible writers. It supports the podcast, but most importantly, it supports all the wonderful indie bookstores out there. So we appreciate you checking that out.
Hey.
And have a great rest of your night.
Thank you.
Bye.